Good afternoon and welcome. This panel is about Hezbollah and Iran. And when we think about both these, if you want to say entities, they're often thought about together. Right? Hezbollah, of course, is perhaps Iran's greatest success in terms of its foreign policy around the Middle East, and a tremendously important source of power for the Iranian government. At the same time, Hezbollah has its own interests and its own politics. Iran plays a greater role in the region when it comes to supporting violence, far beyond Hezbollah. So there's overlap, but also tremendous difference. In case you've been under a rock for the last month, I'll simply say that both Hezbollah and Iran's role in the region and the violence linked to Iran have been repeatedly on the front pages. This shows up in terms of the tremendous turmoil in Lebanon itself right now. Really, on a daily basis, there are fundamental questions about the future of the political system in Lebanon and the role of Hezbollah and Hezbollah allies in it. It also shows up on a regional basis. I see several experts in the room who've been following the Syria conflict closely, among others. And we can't talk about Syria, we can't talk about Israel and the Palestinian territories without talking about Hezbollah. And the last thing I'd say, of course, is we have to think about this internationally. Iran and Hezbollah over the years have conducted or plotted terrorist attacks in South America, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, and there have also been Iranian-linked attacks, or attempts, I should say, in the United States. So we have a tremendous range of problems, and this set of problems is now perhaps more pressing for US foreign policy and for world foreign policies than it's been at any time in recent years. I'm delighted that this afternoon we have two fantastic experts to guide us. Hanin Ghaddar is a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She is a specialist on Lebanon and the Levant in general with tremendous knowledge of Hezbollah. Talking alongside her is Ariane Tabatabai. I will say if you look at her bio carefully, her career has actually gone downhill. She is now, unfortunately, a prominent political scientist at the RAND Corporation, but until very recently, she was a professor here at Georgetown in the Security Studies program. We are very, very sorry to have lost her, although it's to RAND's great gain. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Tabatabai, please.
Dan, thank you so much. And I don't know what to make of your comment here, but I'll sit on it and I'll circle back. It's a pleasure to be back on campus. The last time I was in this room was actually for comps, so I'm happy to be here for a more joyous occasion than talking about what comps might entail. So what I thought I would do is I would start with a bit of a conversation about the so what part of this. Dan already laid some of this out, but I want to start by talking a little bit about why Iran's relationship with proxies in general and Hezbollah in particular matters. And then I thought I would kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about the history. Obviously, you know, again, if you haven't been living under a rock, you've been seeing a lot of developments recently with regard to Iran. People have been chasing headlines with regard to what Soleimani's death might mean for the United States, for Iran, for US-Iran relations, terrorism in general. And so I thought I would take a step back and put it all in a historical context before talking a little bit about what Iran actually gets out of proxy relationships. And then I'll end on Hezbollah and pass it to the actual expert on Hezbollah to talk to us about what the relationship entails and how Iran leverages Hezbollah. So let me start with the so what. Iran is one of 4 countries to appear in the National Defense Strategy and in the National Security Strategy. If you look at the 4 countries, they're Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And the outlier, of course, is the one non-nuclear weapon state in the equation. The reason why Iran is as much of a challenge as it is actually not because it has conventional forces that can match those of the United States. It's not because it has nuclear weapons. It's not because it has a strong economy. None of those are really a factor. The main reason is that Iran has been able to punch above its weight in many ways, and to do that thanks to mostly asymmetric tools, and at the core of this sits Iran's network of proxies, which is sometimes referred to as the ITN, the Iran Threat Network, or the Iranian Threat Network. So the network at this stage has tens of thousands of fighters. As Dan was mentioning at the beginning, not all of them respond directly to Iran. The levels of command and control are different. The levels of support are different. But all in all, Iran has a network of dozens of groups across half a dozen countries with reach above and beyond Iran's immediate neighborhood in South and Central Asia and the Middle East. And it has tens of thousands of forces that have been able to kind of allow Iran to overcome its political isolation in the region. But we tend to think of Iran's relationship with proxies as sort of a novel development. And by novel, I mean 40 years ago, when the Islamic Republic replaced the imperial state of Iran after the Islamic Revolution, we tend to think of Iran starting these relationships with these proxy networks. And that's not the case at all. Actually, when the revolutionaries took over, they began to build on an infrastructure that had already been laid out by the Shah, who was US aligned, and his security forces, who had already started to cultivate some of these non-state partners, including in Lebanon, but also in Iraq, in Yemen, and Afghanistan. If all of those sound familiar, it's because those are exactly places where Iran is still working with non-state partners today. So the Savak, the Shah's intelligence services, were laying out these foundations, and when the revolution happened in the 1980s, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, of course, was created, and they took over. There were actually Savak operatives who joined and helped the Islamic Republic kind of gain ground in these different countries in the context of the Iran-Iraq War. So building on the tools that the Savak had acquired, the IRGC begins to work with various militias, various terrorist groups throughout the region, and it really ups the support for these groups throughout the 1980s and 1990s, bringing us to where we are today. That said, the relationship that Iran has with non-state actors is not necessarily a constant, right? It has changed a lot, it has evolved a lot. Prior to the revolution, it was there was some support, but you didn't have the foundational relationship that Iran has today with these groups, and that they weren't a cornerstone of Iranian defense thinking. Today, if you remove the ITN from Iran's defense and security thinking, you're left with very few other tools that would allow Iran to compete effectively with its adversaries in the region. And so Iran has been much more reliant on these non-state partners than it had been in the past. So I want to talk a little bit about why it is that Iran actually works with non-state actors. We tend to think of this as something that is pretty costly for a country. Why build a whole national security and national defense strategy around non-state partners that are not always very reliable? Well, there's a few reasons. The first one is that, again, Iran is not a nuclear-armed state. It has pursued a nuclear weapons program in the past, but it does not currently have a nuclear deterrent. So part of the reason why it uses these groups is to expand its strategic depth, is to be able to deter various adversaries, Israel, the United States, and others in the region. It's also using these groups, again, to overcome this conventional inferiority that it experiences compared to a lot of its adversaries, the United States chiefly, but also US-backed partners in the region, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE. So Iran has been using non-state partners to help it overcome its conventional inferiority, to defend itself in the case of a conflict. Next, there's the fact that Iran doesn't really have a whole lot of allies, state allies, in the traditional sense anymore. Since the revolution, Iran has lost most of the partners that it had under the Shah. The United States was a key partner and supplier for Iran, as were a lot of European countries in the region. And also Iran had a pretty decent relationship with Israel, which we can come back to. But all of those things have disappeared, essentially, right? So at this point, Iran, sitting now in 2020, only has truly a couple of allies that it can count on, the Assad regime being one of them, which is why it was willing to go to bat for Assad at the beginning of the Syrian civil war. And then you have Russia and China, which are actually kind of partners that step in when it's in their interest, but they're not very reliable partners for Iran. There is no alliance of sorts. If Iran were to get attacked tomorrow by the United States, Russia and China would wait and would actually think about the implications of their own involvement and wouldn't just jump in to support Iran. And you can see all of that actually in practice play out since 2018, since the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, with both Russia and China have been very careful not to antagonize the United States, essentially, by kind of taking sides. So to overcome the lack of allies and real nation-state partners, Iran has been building these relationships. There's also the fact that Iran is a bit of a is othered often in the region. It's a majority non-Arab, non-Sunni country, and has typically had relationships that have been marked by tensions with its partners, with its neighbors. And so in order to, again, overcome this, and in order to make sure that it has some sort of influence in the domestic politics of its neighboring countries, it has worked with various non-state actors in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and elsewhere. And so in gaining influence in various countries has been at the center of Iran's non-state relationships. There are also a couple of counterintuitive reasons why Iran works with non-state actors. One is intelligence, and another one is actually, in some cases, counterterrorism. But of course, the way Iran sees it is that it uses these non-state actors, some of which are terrorist groups, to combat terrorist threats that are posed, that challenge Iranian security. And so there are a couple of reasons why Iran may work with non-state actors that we don't typically think of as drivers behind a nation's relationship with non-state partners. Of course, there are costs to all of these relationships and to this policy, right? First of all, the United States has considered Iran to be the foremost state sponsor of terrorism for a number of years. With that comes, there's of course the symbolic and political problems that are associated with that for Iran, but there's also a real cost, and that is framed in terms of sanctions, right? Iran has a number of entities within the country, including the IRGC, that are designated as terrorist organizations, foreign terrorist organizations, and that are sanctioned. So there are real costs that are associated with this policy. And that raises a question, obviously here, but also in Iran itself, within the regime and within the population, as to why it is that Iran is still leveraging non-state actors as a tool. And I think the answer is that, sort of, again, sitting and looking at the costs and benefits of this course of action, the regime has decided that the costs don't outweigh the benefits. That ultimately, because Iran is othered, it is alienated, isolated, it doesn't have the conventional means to compete with its adversaries, that it is actually worth the sanctions and the reputational costs to continue working with these groups. So with this, I want to turn a little bit to Hezbollah itself, because I think Hezbollah is, as Dan was mentioning at the beginning, is actually the main success story that Iran has. It's not always loyal to Iran. Hanin will get to this, but it has been one of the most, if not the most loyal group that Iran has in its toolbox. And it's actually played a really significant role in allowing Iran to expand its network of non-state partners in the region. Today, Iran doesn't have to directly train or support various groups. It can go via Hezbollah, and that allows it to obviously increase plausible deniability, but also to lower the costs of supporting various groups for itself. So I'll give you one example. A lot of Iran's relationship with the Houthis in Yemen, a lot of Iran's work in Yemen is actually done via Hezbollah rather than Iran sending IRGC forces to Yemen. We don't have very good numbers in terms of how many guards or Iranians have gone to Yemen in the open source, but from what we know, it's actually not a very significant number. And the reason why Iran has been able to do that and not send its own people and resources to a country that ultimately doesn't matter too much to it, is because it is able to leverage a group that has the capabilities and the loyalty that Hezbollah has. And that's, of course, not the only place where Iran is working via Hezbollah. Syria is another place where Iran has been able to leverage these relationships. And of course, in Lebanon, having the ability for Iran to use Hezbollah to directly deter Israel, to directly harass Israel, and to have a support base and influence in Lebanese politics, a very significant country for Iran historically and politically today, has been at the forefront of Iran's efforts in Lebanon. So I think I'll stop here and let Hanin take over.
All right, thank you very much for your introduction, Ariane. That was really, really interesting and great overview. So I'm going to go into the details. I'm going to dig into different details of Hezbollah's phases. I want to start with the idea that you kind of ended it with, which is the loyalty, the relationship actually between Hezbollah and Iran. What is it? We all know, of course, that Iran helped found Hezbollah back in the 80s, early 80s. They funded the group. They've been funding the group. Majority of Hezbollah's funding comes straight from Iran. They do have some other source of funding, but this is not the main sources of funding for Hezbollah. Iran also trained the party. Logistically, militarily, they provided them with weapons, they provided them with the intelligence, everything they need. So in a way, they are Iran's proxy. They did have some kind of margin of maneuver when it comes to domestic politics in Lebanon, mainly in the domestic politics in Lebanon, because also Iran understands that Hezbollah understands Lebanon more than anyone else. So in a way, they trusted Hezbollah to take certain decisions domestically, how the government should be formed, when they are going to participate in the government and when they shouldn't. These shifts within Hezbollah's role in Lebanon, I believe, were mainly made by Hezbollah's leaders. However, and I will talk more about this later, is that this margin of maneuver has shrank through the phases of Hezbollah. Lots of the decisions today are made still by Iran, except for the details that no one really is the names of the people, for example. And this is due to the fact that Hezbollah's role has widened in the region. And this takes me to the second point. I want to talk a little bit about Hezbollah's regional role and Hezbollah's domestic role and how it shifted in the past 10 years and how these shifts also create challenges and gains for Hezbollah and what brought us today to the protests in this region. So Hezbollah has been involved with Iran in the regional endeavors in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen. And Iran has been very much focused in the past 10 years and through Hezbollah mainly and other proxies on creating what people call the Shia Crescent or the land corridor that links Lebanon to Tehran to Iran through Syria and Iraq. And they have been meticulously and diligently working on creating this land corridor and making sure that this is the major achievement in the region, which will project Iran's power in the region. Mainly, this is not just a land corridor, it's not a practical road that connects Tehran to Beirut. It's one projects Iran's power in the region. And also, in a way, it's ideological. It helps their ideological Shiism in the region in the sense that a lot of the Hezbollah fighters, for example, and some Hezbollah supporters that I've talked to in the past few years, they see it as the nation for the Shia. Wilayat al-Imam Ali, something that is very ideological. It's not just a corridor. It's like the ummah of the Shia. So this is more of a ideological victory, military victory, and also a very political victory in the region. So this was the main achievement of Iran. They suffered a lot. They had to sacrifice a lot of financial resources, a lot of human resources. They even had to ignore certain defeats here and there in order to, with the bigger picture in mind, which is achieve this corridor, this crescent. And Hezbollah has been involved in this Shia Crescent or Shia Empire from the very, very beginning. In Syria, we know that they have been involved in 2011 or 2012, depending on their official statement or actual involvement. But then, of course, we know they've been involved in Iraq even earlier with helping with the logistics and organization of the Shia proxies. This news that is coming today that Iran has tasked Hezbollah of replacing Soleimani in the region, there have been some reports about that. I don't think this is new. This has been definitely happening for a while. They've been helping Soleimani in the region. Like Ariane said, that they have been helping in Yemen because of the language, actually, you know, like the culture. They do understand Arabs more than the Iranians. This is like a language barrier. And language is not like, it's not enough for an Iranian to speak Arabic in order to function within these cultures. You need to understand the culture, how these people think and react to things. So that was one of the challenges, actually, that Soleimani had in the region. For example, when Hezbollah's main field commander was killed in Syria, Mustafa Badreddin, allegedly killed by Soleimani himself because of some issues and arguments over Aleppo and who to send to Aleppo and finances. This guy was not replaced. He replaced Imad Mughniyi originally, but this guy was replaced by 4 junior commanders. Qasem Soleimani wanted to be hands-on. He wanted to be hands-on in Syria, he wanted to be hands-on in Iraq, and he wanted to be hands-on in Lebanon. This is where Hezbollah's margin of maneuver and decision-making started to shrink because Soleimani, wanted to be involved in every single detail. And this was one of the challenges because he does speak Arabic, which is very true. His Arabic is impeccable, but this culture is different than the language. And this is what a lot of fighters that I've talked to, and also Syrians who worked with them, they do not understand sometimes what he's saying, even in Arabic. They have this, like, they feel there's a gap between them. There's this cultural gap, and there's also some kind of they said, like the word they used most of the time, I'm just reporting here, that he's been like very, very arrogant. He treated them as the employees, the Arab employees versus the Persian boss. That was his attitude, and this created a lot of problems. That's why Hezbollah was asked to help a lot more. So this is not new. Hezbollah's been doing this for a long time, and they've been trying to cover the challenges for Soleimani. But this Shia Crescent that they have achieved today is turning, according to some of their own people, to Iran's 3 Vietnams. You know, like Lebanon, protests broke out in the streets. In Iraq, protests broke out. In Iran, you know, like this is the Shia Crescent that's supposed to be Iran's main achievement and help Iran project power and help Iran's economy. And now it is the main challenge of Iran, right? So what happened is that they lost a lot of human resources and financial resources in this Shia Crescent. But today, despite Hezbollah's gains in this, which is the regional role, their projection of power in Lebanon that helped them win the elections last year and form the government and take control over state institutions. Hezbollah also was involved in the precision missile project that I can talk about more later. This is one of their main projects today. They're creating precision missiles guided by GPS in order to use against Israel, whether for deterrence for the first phase or for during war later. They have more influence in 3 countries, but today they have lost a lot of the elite commanders. For example, the one I talked about, the field commander, Mustafa Badreddin, they don't have anyone today. Soleimani was their field commander. So it's not only an Iranian challenge today that Soleimani is gone. For Hezbollah, they don't have a field commander. So this is one of the challenges that they're facing. They don't have elite commanders that they fought the 2006 war. Most of them died in Syria. They have a financial crisis, of course, because of all the US sanctions on Iran. Iranians cannot send them the same amount of money that they used to get. According to Lebanese sources well, we're not 100% sure about that, but it has been cut to half. And they have to find different sources that cannot, like the new sources of funding, like smuggling and Iraq's economy is still not enough to make up for the loss that they lost in Iran. But the main challenge that they have is really this fighting force. The fighting force, their elite fighters, their commanders that they lost, and also the people they recruited very quickly. They didn't spend time and they weren't meticulous at training them ideologically and militarily, and they didn't choose them the way they used to choose them. I remember I come from the south of Lebanon where a lot of people joined Hezbollah in the 80s, and it was a very impressive process of recruiting. They take their time, interview them, they say no to many people. In Syria, it was like the opposite. They just recruited anyone. So today, you have a fighting force that is a mixture of old fighters, but also a lot of new fighters who are not ideological, not religious, not disciplined. So this is a new challenge that they have in these days. They try to maneuver this by using the Iraqi economy and creating soft power initiatives in Syria and working with the Russians. But today, they have to deal with a different kind of crisis that they haven't even thought of, they haven't strategized for. So today, the protests broke out. In Iraq, it's very obvious, like it's very clear against the Iranian proxies in Iraq. It's very clear against Qasem Soleimani and his proxies. In Lebanon, it's much more indirect, right? In Lebanon, Hezbollah found itself in a very critical situation. People are protesting against the authorities in general and the sectarian system. But Hezbollah today is the authority. If people are going after the government, Hezbollah today is the majority of the government in Lebanon today is Hezbollah, and we just formed a new government yesterday, and it's 100% Hezbollah. And people are protesting against corruption. And Hezbollah's main allies, the two main allies, the Christian Party, Gibran Bassil, and the president, Michel Aoun, and Nabih Berri, their Shia ally, are the three main corrupt people in the country, and the street is mostly condoning these allies. So Hezbollah today decided to side with the authorities, protect corruption, and be against the street. And this is the first time ever, because Hezbollah has always prided itself for decades of protecting the impoverished and fighting injustice, and today they sided with the authorities against injustice. Right, so this is a big problem for Hezbollah today. So at home, they have to, they lost the resources, the new resources through their access to state institutions. The economy is falling, and they don't know what to do with the current economy. They cannot cover the failure of the Lebanese economy. They don't have the money, and they don't have allies. The Shia community is starting to rise against them. I can't say that the Shia community as a whole is against Hezbollah, but the divisions are very clear. The three main Shia cities in Lebanon, Nabatiyeh, Sur in the south, and Baalbek in the Bekaa, the three main cities witnessed demonstrations. There are still witnessing demonstrations today. They try to oppress them. They try to use violence against them, threaten these people. It's not stopping. I personally did not expect that, but it's a challenge. And they are also still asked to be part of the region and help, especially now that Soleimani is gone, and it's something they cannot do. They cannot be stretched that far. They don't have the resources. So how are they going to maneuver this? And this is my last point. They are trying to maneuver this new crisis. This is and this is something that what we need to look for as we move forward. They have maneuvered previous challenges that came from the role in the region. But today, it's more acute. It's financial, and it's social, and it's economic. They forgot to translate their victories in the region to socioeconomic visions, and people realize that these military victories do not put food on the table. And this is something they have to solve, right? They have two strategies. On the military side, they are trying to avoid war with Israel as much as they can. They still want to work on the precision weapons, but they don't want to provoke Israel to an extent that they bomb their facilities in Lebanon the way they are bombing them in Syria and Iraq. So this is something that they have to work on very smartly. They have to keep the deterrence at this point, but at the same time, not to provoke Israel. They can't go to war for three simple reasons. Not now. One, they do not have the money to fund the war. They need to recruit new people and pay them. Two, they're worried about the refugees. In 2006, these refugees went to Syria and to the other cities of Lebanon. Today, the other cities of Lebanon are full of Syrian refugees, and they cannot go to Syria. And three, which is the most important part, reconstruction is not guaranteed at all. They cannot get the same money for reconstruction they got post-2006. So they are trying to avoid war with Israel. But they will continue working on the precision missiles. And they're going to redeploy their forces to south of Lebanon, a little bit to Iraq, keep some in Yemen, but they're definitely going to work a lot on training these new recruits and recruiting new people with as much money that they can make. So this is a big challenge that they're trying to do. Internally, on the economic side, this new government that was formed yesterday, you look at it, you see new faces, but in fact, it's all representative of Hezbollah's ally. In Lebanon, people call it either the government of one color, which means only Hezbollah's allies, or the Halloween government in the sense that it's masked because it's covering the actual politicians, the corrupt people that the street is fighting. So they decided to go with this government, which is one color, 100% their allies, and defy the street and defy the international community because they simply think that this is the only way to keep power. If they let go, they will lose. They do not want to let go of Lebanon. Lebanon is their jewel. It's Iran's jewel. It's like the only place that they can 100% secure without Russian competition and without Najaf in Iraq, for example. So they are going to tighten their control, use state institutions even more in order to increase their smuggling operations from and to Lebanon, like drug smuggling, bringing in, like Iranian medicine and medical supplies to Lebanon. It's flooding the market today. Iranian medicine is just like everywhere. It's so cheap and it's available, while the others are not available anymore because of the financial crisis. They are going to prepare for the collapse. They already are asking their people to, plant basic grains and vegetables in land that are not being used. They are storing food for the post-collapse. And also, they are trying, Lebanon today needs around $15 billion in order to pay its dues in cash. We need like $15 billion to just flood the banks. And this is a lot of money that the international community so far, in the Paris meeting that happened in December, decided that Lebanon's government is not going to be bailed out unless it is capable, that is experts, that is going to do reforms, and independent. This government is not independent, and obviously it's not going to do any reforms. Nobody believes that. It's just like a facade. So, but they are going to do, and Hezbollah knows that no one is going to believe them. So what they're going to do is that they are going to trade, as usual, stability for the status quo. So they're going to use two cards. They know that the U.S. today is worried about their interests and their troops in the region. And Hezbollah might today say, we are in the region, we have influence over Shia proxies, so maintaining the status quo in Lebanon will help us, and we will guarantee some kind of stability. Whether it's going to work or not, this is another issue, but they're trying this. They're definitely trying this. For the Europeans, they're using the refugees card. Europe is worried about the flood of refugees, not only Syrian and Palestinian from Lebanon, but also Lebanese in case of economic collapse, because they will become also refugees. So Europe is definitely worried about the refugee issue. So Hezbollah is using the refugee card with Europe. So far, the international community has been very solid about reforms, not just any reforms, the ones that were stipulated by Sadr 2 years ago, and a government that is accepted by the street. The street has rejected the government from second one, not day one. This protests are still going on against this government, and the international community has made a statement. But the French made a statement, Macron made a statement, and Pompeo made a statement about this, both of them saying that let's see if this government makes reforms. And personally, this scares me because it's not very decisive in the sense that this government is not independent. No one said that. So we'll see what that means, but I think this is the main question today when it comes to Hezbollah and Lebanon. Is the international community going to bail out Lebanon and legitimize Hezbollah's government or not? So hopefully not. I'll end here.
Thank you both for really putting a fantastic groundwork here. I'm going to actually start by kind of asking you each a question that was gnawing at me as you were speaking. For Ariane, if I could start, one question that is consuming a lot of the people in the policy world are the Iraqi proxy issues, which is there have been attacks on U.S. facilities in Iraq, and the U.S., of course, has been going after the proxies directly. Is the word proxy actually correct? Right? Are these groups that really are acting entirely at the behest of Iran? Are they independent? How much wiggle room is there, especially when it comes to attacks on U.S. forces? So if I can ask you to start there.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think the first thing to understand is that not all of the Iraqi Shia militias are created equal, right? They're different. We tend to think of them as sort of a monolithic entity, but there are actually a bunch of different groups within the Shia militias. And all of them have different relationships with Iran. Some of them are quite aligned with Iran, others are not. I would say that at least two of them that are the most significant threats today to U.S. forces, to U.S. presence in Iraq, are quite aligned with Iran, actually, and are much more aligned in terms of command and control, in terms of loyalty, in terms of ideology, and get quite a significant amount of resources and support from Tehran. And that's in contrast with some of the other groups. The Houthis, for example, would be an interesting counterpoint, where they don't always respond to Iran. There's been more and more support over the past few years as Iran has seen its efforts in Yemen translate into success for it. It's allowed it to kind of bog down the Saudis and expand its influence there. But typically and historically, there have been cases of the Houthis kind of ignoring Iranian directives, whereas that's not necessarily been the case with Kataib Hezbollah, for example, which is the group that initially led the strikes that translated into the first American fatality, from which all of the events of the past month sort of started and snowballed. So Kataib Hezbollah is quite aligned with Iran. It's been at the forefront of Iranian efforts in Iraq, and there are other groups that have been fairly responsive to Iran in Iraq as well.
One thing that you didn't talk about that much in your remarks was kind of the future of Syria.
Yeah.
And I know you've thought a lot about that in your other work. But can you talk about now in the context of Hezbollah, which is Hezbollah has poured so many resources into Syria and lost so many people.
Yeah.
Given that the situation is changing in Lebanon, as you said, but also in Syria, how do you see the future there?
Yeah, thank you very much for asking this question. I really wanted to talk more about the role in Syria. Now that the fighting has subsided a little bit, they don't have to send so many troops to Syria or keep actually a lot of troops in Syria. So they redeployed. They got back a lot of these people to Lebanon, but what they kept in Syria are people to follow up on the soft power initiatives. So what they're trying to do in Syria today is to build routes, because they know that Syria, which is the difference between Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, is that Syria is not majority Shia. In Lebanon, they're not majority, but they're 1/3. So Syria, it's a completely different story. They need the routes. They don't have the routes. So Iran's main strategy in Syria today is to work with the Russians, of course, keep working with the Russians, and they don't really compete. I think what they do is they're negotiating the division of the space in Syria and the resources. They're still very good allies. So Iran today is just building routes, and Hezbollah is helping because they understand the communities as well, right? So they're focused on all of Syria, but mostly on three areas where Iran thinks that they have strategic interests. One in the Damascus and its suburbs. So Sayyida Zainab in Damascus is still very much Hezbollah's headquarters, where they have a lot of religious and religious schools and centers. But they're also working very closely with the Syrian government in order to purchase land and properties. So what they're doing is that they're kind of creating Hezbollah, but basically Iran via Hezbollah. They're creating Dahi too. In Lebanon, Hezbollah's headquarters is the Dahi, which is the southern suburbs of Beirut. So the suburbs of Damascus, Sayyida Zainab and around it is going to be like their Dahi, their Syrian Dahi. So they're not there yet, but this phase is about purchasing lands and properties and try to reconstruct some of the areas and doing a lot of religious and ideological teaching. The other area is Deir ez-Zur, Bukamal, where they're working very closely with the tribes. And the tribes there, some of them have already been allied with the Iranians for a very long time. Some of them are not. So what they're doing there is that they're providing salaries and jobs and working with some tribes in order to gain loyalty. They need just the loyalties of the tribes. And they're succeeding to a certain extent. Doesn't mean that all of this area is now loyal to Iran, but they're working on it. They're very patient. They're not in a rush. They know that this takes time. In the south of Syria, the border of Israel and Jordan, this is where also they're focusing. What they're doing there, because they know that the Israeli threat is there, and they want to use also that area as another front in case of a war with Israel. So what they're doing there is also gaining the loyalty of the people. They're not asking the Syrians there to become Shia or to fight with them. What they want is to create some kind of a loyal community that is benefiting from salaries, and they're helping with the agriculture a lot of agriculture initiatives in order to create this community and young fighters. So Hezbollah is creating their own proxy in Syria. So in case at one point Iran is asked to leave Syria, whatever happens, they're not going to, but whatever happens, at one point they were forced to leave Syria, they will have roots through these soft power initiatives, and they will have their own proxies, Syrians. Because you cannot kick Hezbollah out of Lebanon, they're Lebanese. They want to create something similar in Syria where you don't have, where you have Syrians that basically you cannot kick out of Syria. So this is their strategy in Syria.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to go in groups of 2 for questions, at least to start, and may switch off. So who wants to kick us off, please? Yes, in the back.
Yes, thank you. I guess very briefly, you mentioned the reduced funding that Iran has been able to provide to Hezbollah, and I guess some of the stressors that have come as a result of the Shia Crescent and the maximum pressure campaign. So then, are there any indications of any fraying loyalties now that there's reduced funding, fraying loyalties on the part of Hezbollah, and then maybe a prediction if this continues, where that might go, or any things that we might look for that would indicate that? And then also, is anyone holding? Is there any indication that the people of Lebanon, now that Hezbollah has taken control over the government there, is there any indication that the people are holding Hezbollah accountable for the violence that's being exacted against the protesters, or is it still just perceived as the government, but not necessarily Hezbollah specifically?
Let me get one more question on, yes, right, also in the back, but sitting down, please.
So in the aftermath of Soleimani's death, the social media fake narratives were hot and heavy and started almost immediately. I saw everything ranging from Soleimani didn't do nothing, which I find improbable, to Soleimani did 9/11, which I also find improbable. So in the interest of dispelling the fog, to what extent has the Quds Force played a direct role in international terror generally?
Hanin, can I ask you to start, and then we'll go to Ariane, please.
I'll take the first question. All right, thank you for your question. In terms of loyalties, I think this is like you opened a very complicated but most interesting thing for me. I think, like as a researcher, I'm looking very closely at these like loyalties. I find it sometimes difficult to explain, but I've always tried to say that the Shia community in Lebanon is not one entity, right? And this is where these shifts happen and opportunities occur. The Shia community has never been one entity, and this is where Hezbollah has been trying so hard. When Hezbollah had the resources, they used to cater for all of the Shia community. Their social services, their jobs, their funding, medical, educational, everyone in the Shia community was able to use their resources. This is one of the pillars of public support. The second pillar of public support was the resistance that Hezbollah liberated the south of Lebanon from the Israeli occupation. Whether you believe it or not, or actually the 2000 liberation was an actual liberation or an Israeli decision, perspective is important, and the Shia perceive that Hezbollah liberated the south of Lebanon, and this is the most important thing. So this is the other pillar of support. The third pillar of support is the Shia empowerment and the Shia identity. So they came in and said, like, of course, they didn't create that. Musa Sadr of Amal started with politicizing the Shia community. Hezbollah took over. But they did empower the Shia. They gave them this feeling of being in Arabic, they call them Ashraf al-Nas, the most honorable people, and they believed that. And they gave them more power in state institutions. They gave them more power on the ground. They, through the resistance, through Hezbollah's status in the region. The problem today is that because Hezbollah lost two of its pillars, that is catering for the Shia community, today Hezbollah gradually started to cater less and less. And this shows you the differences, the groups within the Shia community, how Hezbollah started gradually to give less and less. At the beginning, it was everyone. And everybody thought that the Shia are one big entity. And then you realize that when they went to Syria, they started catering only for Hezbollah's community and their fighters. And that's the difference between the Shia community and Hezbollah's community. Hezbollah's community is everyone who is a member, their families, their friends, their milieu. And this community was more important for them to maintain than the rest of the Shia community, who are not members, who are not religious. A lot of them were leftist, communists, who supported Hezbollah only because of the resistance. And then after Aleppo, things have changed as well. And after sanctions on Iran, things have changed. And then they started to cater only for the fighters' community. And there's a third layer, because there's also a difference between Hezbollah's community and the fighters' community. And today, they can't even cater for all of the fighters. So they started to put on hold all the new recruits that they do not need. So they fired a lot of people. And this is really the gaps between these groups today is very apparent in the sense that not only Hezbollah that lost its capability of supporting the Shia community and telling them, they've always historically told the Shia community that forget about the state cannot provide for you, I will provide for you, I'm your father. And they treated Hezbollah as the father figure. Today Hezbollah lost this father figure to the Shia community, they cannot provide. But also they have lost resistance, because despite the rhetoric about resisting Israel and fighting Israel, the deterrence is on both sides, right? Hezbollah has been deterred because of all the factors I talked about earlier. And they really have been fighting in the region, saying that the road to Jerusalem passes through Zabadani and Damascus and Baghdad and all those. And no one believes them. They know that the road to Damascus the road to Jerusalem is like straight line. You don't have to go all around. So no one believes that. And the resistance has been put on hold, and people don't feel that Hezbollah is doing. They've been being hit in Syria by the Israelis almost every week, and they haven't done anything. They haven't responded. It's always the same, the right time and place. And it's the same with Soleimani, the right time and place. The people are hungry. People don't believe them anymore. So yeah, the Shia have been going to the streets. Loyalty, only the ideological people have loyalty to Hezbollah. No matter what, they will follow Hezbollah. And these ideological people are no more than 20% of the Shia community. The rest today either have a lot of questions or are in the streets expressing these questions. Oh, sorry, for the second part, yes, people do hold Hezbollah responsible for the violence and for the corruption, for everything, because today they are the authority. Sorry, go ahead.
So yeah, obviously don't believe everything you see on social media, right? So the truth is somewhere in between. The Quds Force is responsible for nothing, and the Quds Force is responsible for everything. There is no doubt that the Quds Force has either created or exacerbated a lot of issues in the region. In Iraq alone, we were talking about Kataib Hezbollah, but in the 2000s, the Quds Force-backed militias in Iraq were responsible for killing several hundred Americans. So they have contributed significantly to a lot of the instability that we're seeing in the region. But I think one thing that is important to understand is that the Quds Force specifically, and Iran more generally, doesn't necessarily create the situation in which they operate. They just leverage the vacuum, the fragility and corruption of governments, the grievances that exist in various populations. And they use that to expand their influence. It's actually a pretty novel thing that we're seeing in Syria, where they are creating militias from scratch and bringing them, mobilizing them in a different country and then moving them to go fight in a different theater. They didn't typically do that in the past. They worked with local partners in the past, in Lebanon, for example, in Iraq, where they used the grievances that existed, the corruption, mismanagement of various governments, and they helped create or they supported groups that already existed. Now what we're seeing since 2012-ish, roughly, since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, what we're seeing is actually Iran expanding those capabilities and going and mobilizing, recruiting Afghans, Pakistanis, whether it's in Iran, Afghan refugees in Iran, or in Afghanistan or in Pakistan, and then training them and sending them over to an entirely different theater, Syria, to go fight on behalf of somebody else. But that's not typically how Iran has operated and how the Quds Force has operated in the past.
Questions? Yes, in front.
Hi, how are you? My name is Saeed Balani, president of the Institute for Middle East Peace and Progress here in Washington, D.C. First, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your remarks. And I think in your closing remarks, you highlighted on a very real but unfortunate reality. You can't get rid of Hezbollah because they're part of the Lebanese society. I mean, it's unfortunate, but you look politically, socially, economically, they're entrenched. In the 2018 elections, they won most of parliament seats. You look currently in the government that was formed just 2 days ago, it's composed primarily of, Michel Aoun, Gibran Bassil, and Nabi Berri, three open supporters of Hezbollah. I've long thought that the only way that you can really get rid of Hezbollah within Lebanon is through another civil war. But currently, the protests that started in October 17 and that are continuing now have given me hope that perhaps this is a different way that you can get rid of Hezbollah ideologically, changing the perspective and view of people within the society. And as we've seen, it started with the youth and it's gone up and started locally and has become an international movement. So I'm really curious as to what your views on, what your perspective is as far as how to weaken Hezbollah's clench on Lebanese society. As you see in this, even in Sunni, the leader Hassan Diab, he's taken a post that's for a Sunni prime minister. Saad Hariri has been ousted, and nobody has faith in this new Sunni leader. So what's your perspective on how the Shiite Iran has gotten its clasp on as well as Lebanon?
Thank you. Same question. Yes, in the middle.
Hi, thank you, Hanin and Ariane, for sharing your views. I'm just curious, how do you see moving forward Iran's and Hezbollah's state crime and terror nexus with Venezuela, especially that this is a clear example of that changing landscape of threat, and not only of Iran's regional outreach, but also international outreach. Thank you.
Take the first question? Sure. Okay. I still don't think that you can get rid of Hezbollah, and you shouldn't, actually, because at the end of the day, every time someone tries to get rid of Hezbollah, they get stronger. Every war against Hezbollah makes them stronger and they get more support. So I think the best way to do it, unless the regime in Iran changes, which is not that, it's a lot more complicated than this. And even if that happens, Hezbollah is going to stay, it's not that simple. But what you can do is you can contain Hezbollah. You can bring back the political balance to Lebanon. This is one thing. For example, the balance that existed in 2005 to 2009, but without the corrupt politicians of March 14, because they are the problem as well. The anti-Hezbollah camp of that area was a problem as well, because they are the corrupt politicians that today the street is against. This is one. Bring back the political balance. But today the street is not just about Hezbollah, right? We have a system that Hezbollah has benefited from, which is the sectarian system in Lebanon that has been played for 100 years. And it is so outdated, and it has failed multiple times, and it's the reason why we have this collapse of economy today. And the street today is very clear. They are against the sectarian system. They want to change this system into a new system through a very independent, representative, non-sectarian electoral law that would produce a new parliament and a new government and a new president, and eventually bring the real new faces. This is the second thing. Early elections, representative electoral law. I'm talking about the practical details. Third thing, I think what you can do is that contain Hezbollah from, if the international community wants to contain Hezbollah, it's definitely not legitimize this government by bailing Lebanon out. Two, continue the sanctions, but be more creative with the sanctions, because going after Hezbollah again and again and again, it's not effective anymore. Hezbollah's economy is a cash economy, and they really do not use the banks. Going after them via the banks and this kind of sanctions that HIFPA and others is affecting them a little bit, but not really much. They maneuvered around this. They still get cash from Iraq today. They don't care. But going after Hezbollah's allies, I think, is a must today. They are the ones who have bank accounts outside Lebanon, and they are the ones who only allied with Hezbollah for financial benefits. And I think today, using the Magnitsky Act to fight corruption, for example, would be great in order to respond to the streets' demands and go for the corrupt politicians, not just like terrorism. You know, this is today is very valid. And also go after Hezbollah's allies personally, individually, and this will not. There are views that using sanctions today will weaken Lebanon's economy, and the U.S. doesn't want to be, involved in this. But going after individuals, not institutions, is a totally different thing. And these allies are individuals with bank accounts outside of Lebanon. So I think this is the third way of doing this. In general, weakening Hezbollah, regaining the political balance, changing the system is going to make Hezbollah lose allies. And when they don't have the same allies and the same power, it means that they do not have the same access within state institutions, because this is how they get power. And this is the way they will be contained. And that's enough for me. If they go back to their small one-party head, and then their weapons is a different system, then you can use the Lebanese state to delegitimize their weapons, to push them to surrender their weapons. When we have a better, less corrupt state, you can do that.
All right, so the trajectory of Iran's regional policies going forward. So I started with the history because what I wanted to highlight is that this is not something that it's not a blip, right? It didn't just magically happen 40 years ago and it'll go away with a potential change in regime, or if we sanction Iran enough that they all of a sudden decide that they're actually going to change their behavior completely. So my sort of reading of it, just based off of what Iran has done over the past 60, 70 years, is that we're going to see a great deal of continuity in the policies. And that's obviously bad news for much of the region and from a US perspective. But I just don't see Iran changing its the way it does things, right? A lot of people were talking about what Soleimani's death might mean for the Quds Force because he was such a visible, symbolic person, right? But Soleimani was one part of a larger institution, a very important part of a larger institution, I should say. But he was just one part of it. And his strength, actually, a lot of his strength was due to the fact that he helped create the Quds Force and not help create it, but help institutionalize it and help it get the capabilities that it has today. But he helped create an institution that would outlast him. And in doing that, he built on the roots that were laid out on the foundations that were laid out decades prior to him even being anywhere close to the Iranian armed forces. So moving forward, I don't think that Soleimani's death or even a more drastic kind of regime or government change, transition of power in Iran, will necessarily translate in different behavior. We might see tweaks here and there, but fundamentally, I think we'll see a lot of the same. And just to, again, give you an example, if you look at the Supreme Leader's comments on why Iran needs to be involved in Syria, it's fascinating to see how much of the language is directly replicating things that were said by the Shah's officials several decades before when they were justifying why they had to be involved in Lebanon. And so the thinking, the mindset isn't changing. It might evolve, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see a fundamental change in behavior that, if we sanction them enough, maybe they'll just withdraw from all the theaters where they're involved, or they'll stop supporting Hezbollah or various other groups.
Can I get you to answer a very tough question, which is
What else am I here?
Exactly. The Soleimani killing was criticized for the most part by much of the kind of Washington, I'll say, foreign policy commentariat, and as being very high risk, not having necessarily a big impact, probably going to backfire in the United States. What I've heard from you and Hanin, though, is actually makes me much more optimistic, right? That Hanin is saying this was a major blow to Hezbollah, which lost a very important figure in its command chain. In general, this was someone who is not that the Quds Force goes away, but nevertheless played a very important role. And that there's a lot of continuity in Iranian policy, that deterrence is strong with Hezbollah. Is it fair to say that this was a kind of a good, quick punch, and then it's a stopping point, and it's not going to create this dangerous cycle of escalation that's going to haunt the Middle East forever?
Yes and no. When it happened, actually, I was living between two worlds, right? Like the Washington world, which was like, oh my God, this is going to be the third World War III, and what are we going to do? And Iran is going to go full berserk over it and kill everyone. And then my world back in the region, between my Lebanese family and friends and my friends in Syria and Iraq, everybody was serving baklava and celebrating, and a lot of my friends even in Washington were having champagne that same night. It's like two different opposing worlds, and I think the main issue here is that Washington was afraid of a war. The region is living through war already. What's going to change anyway? We already have refugees. We already have wars. Already people like this guy has been implicated in killing Lebanese, Syrians, Iraqis, Yemenis, you name it, and his death was a breath of fresh air for these people. Of course, this is an emotional reaction, but at the same time, it's not just emotional. The people in the region, not just the people on the street, we're talking about analysts, we're talking about observers and politicians, they understand what kind of blow this means for Hezbollah. They know that this guy, Hezbollah Today, not only have lost their boss, but also their field commander. And they also know how complicated for Hezbollah and Iran to actually retaliate. Because any retaliation that would cross this red line that was defined by killing Soleimani is going to mean more retaliation from the US, and they simply cannot afford that. And I think it's more than an emotional reaction. It's also a different kind of perspective of how Hezbollah functions. And in a way, part of me still understands that Iran can still, do more. And I think, for example, from Lebanon, the retaliation is not going to be military. It's going to be, as we see, political and diplomatic, and more security appointments to their liking, more military appointments to their liking, more financial appointments to their liking, protecting themselves more. But for the people, that was great.
Ariane, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so also yes and no, I guess. So I think it depends on what the objectives are, right? And that to me is not very well defined, just generally with regard to Iran, but especially with regard to this particular incident. If the objective is to just get rid of one bad guy, then yes, we've done that, and that's great. But there are many more of them, right? The person who has been appointed to replace Soleimani, and that happened actually within hours of Soleimani's death, is a man called Ismail Ghani, who's been around for a number of years. He was the deputy to Soleimani, actually shares a lot of the same characteristics as Soleimani, but of course has some differences. He's not as charismatic, for example. But he brings his own strengths to the table, right? We've gotten rid of one person, but there's a whole institution again there that that can continue the activities, the vision that Soleimani had. So if the objective was a fundamental disruption and getting rid of capabilities, then we're not doing that. If the objective was to get rid of this specific person, then we've perhaps achieved that. The second question to me is what happens next? As Hanin was saying, we still don't have the full scenario here. There was one response that Iran gave just a few days later, and we actually kind of got lucky in that there were no U.S. Fatalities. There have been injuries that we're hearing more and more reports about them. But we were almost kind of lucky, right? Iran was trying to avoid U.S. casualties, but going back to Clausewitz, right? You can never 100% predict that what you're going to do is not going to have consequences beyond what you're planning for. And in fact, from what we know from IRGC sources is that they thought the United States was going to retaliate, and they had planned for an operation that was going to take place in several phases. So they ended the first phase, but they had planned for more phases. And in my view, we're probably going to see more from Iran, and it's not going to be directly striking U.S. bases or Iraqi bases housing U.S. troops in the region, but it may very well be using proxies, cyber activities, and so on and so forth to continue this. So a lot remains to be seen, and we don't have the full picture yet to make a decision, I think, to kind of assess whether or not this the costs and the benefits, the cost-benefit calculus made sense. I think the other thing that I want to point out is that there is a bit of a disruption. Hanin was talking about Soleimani earlier. He spoke Arabic, and he had leader-to-leader relationships that were sort of unparalleled, not just in the region, but within Iran as well. He had this ability to navigate Iranian politics in a way that has been kind of outstanding in recent in the Iranian landscape over the past few decades, in a very polarized system otherwise. And his successor doesn't have that. He's not as charismatic. The few videos of him that are out there, footage that we see of the guy, you kind of fall asleep listening to him. So he's not as charismatic. He doesn't have the same relationships.
He doesn't speak Arabic as well.
I don't know.
He doesn't.
So there you go. That's one more thing that you have to take into account, though he does have very good relationships with Afghanistan and Afghan militias. So that's one area where you can potentially see a growth under this new leadership versus Soleimani and his strength. But so you might see some disruption, but in my view, you're not going to see an overall kind of change in behavior and a complete disruption of Quds Force activities.
Thank you. Lord Carlisle, please.
Given the brilliance of both presentations we've had this afternoon, and I really mean that, I'm going to be very bold and slightly challenge what Dr. Tabatabai has said about the future strength of the Iranian regime. Isn't it plain that both President Trump and Secretary Pompeo both believe that the Iranian regime has now overreached himself, as such regimes usually do, especially in that part of the world? That both before the death of Soleimani and particularly after the Ukrainian aircraft catastrophe, there is clear evidence coming from the streets, not just of Tehran, but of other cities around Iran, of disturbances which are opposed to the Iranian government. That unusually the Supreme Leader spoke at Friday prayers last Friday. What he said probably doesn't matter at all. It's the fact of him being there and saying it for the first time in years that may signify weakness. And that also, I happened to notice that a few days ago, at a visit by the Emir of Qatar with his foreign minister, the Supreme Leader turned up at that talks, not just Rouhani and the foreign minister, which seems to many, certainly in England, informed people, highly unusual. And also, finally, the desperate economic state of Iran for ordinary people out there trying to lead a normal life and not being able to. Doesn't all that provide some evidence of the Iranian regime now being much weaker than may have been implicit in what has been said this afternoon? And if the Iranian regime was to be replaced, wouldn't it be replaced by a regime which leapt upon the available economic benefits from the gas field that Iran shares with Qatar and would lead to Iran recalibrating its foreign policy significantly into the wider world, seeking to be a mainstream state? Now, that may be an optimistic view, but I'm suggesting, I think, that it could be a realistic view.
That's an interesting enough question that I really just want to know the answer now, so please go ahead.
Thank you, because there's like 3 different layers that I want to get to. One, I want to clarify that when I say Iran is unlikely to change its policies and its outlook, I'm not necessarily referring to the strength of the regime and its legitimacy, right? I think that those are 2 different things. Second, in terms of the discontent within the population, there's no doubt that that's ongoing, right? We've been seeing protests. We saw them in November. We saw them again I guess since the beginning of 2020, so this very long month that we're just ending. But I think you need to, again, going back and looking at the historical context, provide some clues. If we think of protests as an unusual thing in Iranian life, then yes, we might think of what's going on here as a big change. But protests are actually a feature in the Islamic Republic. They're not a departure. They're perhaps getting more attention today, and there's social media, so you see a lot more of, you see videos and footage and images, but they've been happening since the beginning of this regime, and actually going back to the early 20th century with the constitutional movement. So protests, discontent, reform efforts are all part of, an inherent part of Iranian public life. And going back just a decade, in 2009, Iran actually, the regime, suffered the biggest blow to its legitimacy. And you had millions of people coming out and protesting against the regime. And it was a moment where, for the first time in years, the regime was actually concerned about what was going to happen next. Incidentally, that's also one of the last times where the Supreme Leader did the Friday prayer, precisely because he felt that sort of pressure and he felt the threat to his legitimacy. The next time and the last time before this past week was, of course, at the beginning of the Arab Spring, where he presided over the Friday prayer and spoke in both Persian and Arabic to kind of, reach out to the world, to the Arab world. So all of this to say that discontent in Iran is typically bubbling under the surface. And sometimes it kind of peaks above and you see it visibly, but it's a feature of public life in Iran. Now, the question to me is, does the regime manage to control this discontent? So far, the answer has been yes, and what we're actually seeing is more willingness and more capabilities by the regime to control dissent within the country. In November, we saw for the first time the regime actually shut down the internet completely, which they hadn't been able to do in the past, and in the course of 72 hours, they killed several hundred, or by the administration's estimate, over 1,000 people, which again is a huge departure from the past. So they are more willing, more capable to deal with dissent, to deal with protest, and to control the situation. So that's one question that remains to be seen. And if you go back again to 2009, and then later in 2012, and then 2017 and 2018, people have been predicting that the Islamic Republic will collapse. And actually, there's a joke that goes around in Iranian families, which is, inshallah, next year in Tehran. Right, but inshallah next year in Tehran has been sort of kicked down the road for 41 years. And so we shouldn't be making policies based on what we hope will happen. We should be thinking about the political reality and dealing with that and making policies accordingly. So yeah, that's the major, I think, question to me that still needs to be answered. Actually, can I say one more thing? I realize you also asked about what happens next if there is a collapse in the regime, right? There are a bunch of different scenarios that can happen. Some of them are, more Some of them are more pleasant to think about, such as you have the current regime topple, and then you have a democratic, sort of secular democracy replacing this regime. But there's also a number of other scenarios that are more likely than that. And that's something else to take into account. So yes, you could have a democracy that replaces the current regime and changes all of the things that we've been talking about. Stop supporting Hezbollah, stops sending troops to Iraq and Syria. But there's also a world in which the next regime ends up being a different flavor of the current one. I'm thinking of a group like the MEK, for example, that has been around for decades, that is sort of seen as a viable alternative by some circles in the city, but that in Iran is actually seen as an illegitimate force precisely because of some of its history and activities in the past. There's also a world in which you have the next Syria or the next Yemen, where you have a civil war that erupts and where you have sort of the same scenario that we've seen elsewhere in the region play out. So there's a number of different things that could happen, many of which are not very positive. There are a couple of positive scenarios, but in my view, they're currently a bit less likely.
Yes, back.
Thank you both for your insightful commentary. I'm aware that the Hariri government was in talks with some Chinese delegations about rebuilding the railway in Lebanon from Sur up to Tripoli. And I was wondering, with the new government dominated by Hezbollah, if you are anticipating a sort of alignment with China, especially with needs for a bailout and anticipation of American sanctions.
That's great. Go. Squeeze in one more question. Dr. Hoffman?
I wonder if I could shift your focus from the Middle East to the Western Hemisphere. Last month, a Lebanese-American man was sentenced in federal district court in New York for carrying out surveillance and other monitoring activities on behalf of Hezbollah. 2 other Hezbollah operatives are awaiting trial and sentencing in the United States who have also been arrested, one who was a confederate of this individual's. So how would you assess Hezbollah's terrorist capabilities in the Western Hemisphere? And in terms, we often talk about that there couldn't be another 9/11, but of course, nearly 20 years ago, Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage had said Hezbollah is the A-team of terrorism. So is this a serious threat? And what do you think would be the conditions that would activate it?
Very quickly on the Chinese link, I think today the new government, Hezbollah, is hoping that they can get the bailout, the real bailout, like cash, not investments, Chinese investments. Because any Chinese investment, the Chinese don't do that. They don't give money. They don't offer bailouts. What they need today is a proper bailout, a lot of flood of cash to Lebanon's banks, and that's the only way of saving Lebanon's economy. And the only people who can actually do it is the international community, that is Europe and the US per se, through the IMF. And this needs the US blessing. Even Qatar last week was offering $5 billion to the central bank to flood the banks. And the Qataris, they were trying to negotiate with the Iranians and see how they can do this. But then France and the US stopped them in their tracks because it's too soon. This is what they need. They need cash. And I don't think the Chinese will be able to do that. So these projects are on hold now. The other country that I'm actually more concerned about is the Russians. They're doing a lot of mediations in Lebanon. They're working with a lot of people. The US, the gap that the US have created in the region, including in Lebanon, has been filled not only by the Iranians, but also by the Russians. They were trying to do a lot of deals with the military that were stopped because of the only leverage that the US has in Lebanon, which is the aid to the Lebanese army. And this is something that the Russians might take on, or in case the U.S. stopped that aid. So this is the more concerning fact. Just quickly on your question, Bruce, is they do, yes, definitely, you're absolutely right. This is a major issue that we need to think about. They've been there for a while, and I think they've been doormat for the simple reason because Iran and Hezbollah has been trying to show that they are partners in fighting terrorism in the region. So they do not want to be the terrorists. They're trying to give these impressions that we are partners in fighting terrorism because of the deal with the U.S., because of all the diplomacy that's been happening around the deal, and also because because they don't want to upset the Europeans. So these cells have been there just watching and being doormat because they're still trying to do that. And I think they will only activate them when they realize that confrontation is the only way and there is no chance for negotiations or diplomacy. That's when they realize this, they will activate them. However, it's not going to be an easy task because they also know that if any of these cells were activated, the response also is going to be great. So they will have to take this into consideration as well. It's not a given that they will be activated. It's a big challenge for them. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
No. Okay, good. Charles Lister in back.
Thank you so much for really interesting comments. I have a Syria-focused question. Surprise, surprise. Generally, a lot of commentary about Hezbollah and Iran in general in terms of its use of proxies, not just in Syria, but region-wide, has focused on the impact of sanctions, Hezbollah's and the Lebanese financial crisis, and the impact that that's had on their ability to continue to run such an expansive array of operations. And Hanin, you focused on that issue quite a bit in terms of Syria. But at the same time, I almost sort of want to counter that by saying some of the activities that you described in terms of the cultural investment, the soft power, as you called it, that costs a lot of money. Those are significant investments. Hezbollah remains militarily engaged all across Syria, in the southwest, in Damascus, around Homs in terms of defense. In Aleppo, they look like they're about to start their biggest military operation in at least 2 years. They continue to fight ISIS in the central desert. That costs a lot of money. They're recruiting thousands of Syrians in southwestern Syria, if you believe some of the reporting, running at least 4 Syrian military bases. That costs a lot of money. So how do you square this circle in terms of the reporting that Hezbollah can't afford to pay its fighters anymore, and yet actually the phase of consolidation that you describe is an even bigger expense in some ways than the operations they were conducting in earlier years?
Yeah.
Hold
Thank you.
Hold on one second.
Yeah.
I think there was another question. Right? Boaz, please.
Also, I would like to thank you for a brilliant talk. I have one question in reference to alternative source of income for Hezbollah. We were talking about Iran as the main source, but what about Hezbollah involvement, say, in criminal activity, counterfeited medicines, Captagon, and other stuff? And also, as a follow-up to Bruce's question, can you describe the ties that Hezbollah still hold with Shiite communities in the Western countries in reference to a source of income, but also maybe as sleeper cells?
Should I take the first one?
Go ahead.
Charles, thanks very much for your question. This has always been something that a dilemma for Hezbollah and for everyone who follows Hezbollah, because you see that they are suffering financially, but at the same time they're still paying salaries for these new fighters. I think Ariane mentioned that earlier, that they are going to use all the resources they have in order to continue helping these proxies. So what they're doing today is that despite the shortage of money coming from Iran, they have developed new sources of funding, right? Which is the Lebanese state institutions, businesses in Lebanon, businesses in Syria. They're using the Iraqi economy, like we know of, like private planes coming to Lebanon with bags of dollars, you know, like to Hezbollah. But the thing is that this money coming in, Hezbollah hasn't been using it to cater for its community anymore. They're using it in places like Syria for recruiting new fighters, Syrian fighters, and soft power initiatives. So this is their problem, is that all the money that is coming in is being used on the regional role. Rather, that's why they only cater for the fighters community, because they still need these fighters to help with their regional role in terms of recruiting new fighters, training new fighters, or soft power initiatives elsewhere. So the money they're getting is only being used on these. This is the main beneficiaries, if you want. That's why they have, you can explain their financial crisis in Lebanon, why they look as if they don't have any money left, but at the same time, they're still operating in Syria. It's because whatever money is left is being spent there, not in Lebanon. And they have started actually for the first time ever taking money from municipalities that they are affiliated with them in order to spend the money they need on charities. Like, for example, during the Ramadan, they have iftars, and you need to spend some money. They take it now from the municipalities, not from their own money. That's spent on the places that you've mentioned. So I think that's, I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's how I saw it.
I mean, the only thing I can add on the Iran side of this is that, you know, the Iranians have been angling very hard to get a piece of reconstruction or several pieces of the pie when it comes to reconstruction in Syria. And, you know, there is not that much money, and there are questions about how that would be paid, but the IRGC would be at the center of those projects, right? A lot of them are infrastructure, energy related projects, which is what the IRGC has a lot of experience doing and has been doing in the country itself and elsewhere. So I suspect that some of those funds, if they do come through, would be used to continue operations there.
Sorry, your question about... Yeah, they have increased drastically their drug operations, Captagon and others, and their smuggling. The smuggling between Lebanon and Syria, and the drugs that is not only ending in Syria and Iraq, but we're talking about the Gulf states as well, like Saudi Arabia and beyond. So they've been doing a lot of smuggling, and this is a lot of money, a lot of income that they're using in the regional operations, not as Hezbollah, but I'm talking about IRGC. This is like part of their spending in the region. This is one of the main smuggling, but today also because of the economic crisis in Lebanon and the fact that the Lebanese market cannot import goods anymore, because when you import, you have to pay in dollars, you have to transfer dollars. And today, the Lebanese banks are not allowing people to transfer dollars. So what's happening is that there's a huge shortage in goods like medicine, and now we're not talking about the luxuries like cell phones and Handa, we're talking about food. So what Hezbollah is doing today is that they're getting a lot of cheap goods from Syria, Iraq, Iran. One way benefiting, because now they are the main providers. So they are selling for cheap, and they're selling and they're making money, but at the same time helping the Iranian markets, helping the Iranians flood the market. So this one of like back and forth of smuggling and importing, this is one way of doing it.
Okay, I think we are at our witching hour. This was really a fantastic way to end what has been, I think, a truly excellent first day of our conference. Before we go and kind of mingle with one another more casually, please join me in thanking both our speakers for a fantastic panel.